Well, Sargon, I remember taking anthropology, and he's given a brief overview, or was it archaeology that I took, and they mentioned Sargon. But yeah, he is sort of a background emperor. Um, Cyrus, I've heard a bit more. Of course, Alex is the most well known. I wanted to get your take on Alexander the Great. I remember Thomas actually pointing this out to me, but when I was in college, I had an Iranian professor who hated Alexander the Great because of what he did to their people. Iranians, from the many that this is just anecdotal information, it's not meant to genericize, but they do not forgive. The same professor I talked about being astonished, she hasn't forgiven him for 800 years, and she hasn't forgiven Alexander the Great for millennia. But what are all the places that he ravaged? I mean, I remember seeing this one video of how human expansion
Yeah.
occurred, and it just seems like there's periods where it's just the humanity spreading across the world, and then when it gets to Alexander the Great, there's just this explosion where his empire is taking over everything. What is even more exciting is when it gets to Genghis Khan, there's another explosion, and the population actually decreases for the first time in human history, at least of recorded human history.
Well, okay, so Sargon's Sargon's empire was in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which is the rivers that now go through Iraq. So that's basically set in modern day Iraq, and uh, that's where the Fertile Crescent was, which was this from the Levant, from where is modern Israel and Lebanon are. There's the Arabian Desert was pretty much the same as it was is now 4,500 or so years ago. So the Fertile Crescent goes north, and it forms this big arc, this crescent around the Arabian Desert. And so on the what would be, if you're looking on a map, on the right side where the Tigris Euphrates pours into the Persian Gulf, the modern Persian Gulf, uh, that's where the towns that are mentioned in Sargon are. And Sargon probably controlled most of that area. There are some legends or some claims that he even conquered. I think it's either Cyprus or Crete. Uh, there's debate about that too, though. But because a few hundred years later, I believe it was, or maybe about 1,000 years later, maybe it's 800 BC, but sometime between Sargon and Cyrus, there was a collapse of all of these Mediterranean civilizations from Egypt to Turkey to the Fertile Crescent because of what was called the Sea Peoples. Peoples probably from Mycenaean Greece, or some people think Sardinia, came along. These were the predecessors of the Phoenicians, and they wiped out a lot of these cultures. But I don't deal with that in these plays. But then then we get and by the way, that so Sargon's is considered the first empire by most. Probably about 90% of historians consider the Akkadian Empire the first, because he united what we would call nations with then just city states along the Tigris Euphrates, Uruk and all of these other Babylon itself, and then Kush is another one, and then we have 1,800 years later. Uh, the Arabian Desert is still sort of this big gape there, but we get the founding of what's called the first Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire, because supposedly there was a mythic founder called Achaemenes. Not Sargon, Cyrus is either the grandson or the great grandson of this Achaemenes. He is the second of the Cyruses. His empire is modern day Iran, all of what Sargon had, plus Egypt, plus Turkey he conquered, which the western end of Turkey, outside of Anatolia, was the empire of Lydia, controlled by Croesus. So his empire included Sargon's empire, but all Sargon's empire made up maybe about 20% of the whole Persian Empire, maybe only 15%. So his empire was bigger and was the biggest land empire at that point, 500 BC, that the world had ever seen. 200 years later, the Persian Empire is the equivalent of, you know, a superpower then, although they weren't really superpowers, but it was the biggest, it was still the biggest empire. Things like people like Darius or Darius the Great came along, and other Dariuses and other Cyruses, and Alexander comes along. Macedonia is just a little territory north of most of the Greek city-states. They don't even like the Macedonians. They consider them barbarians. Alexander's father, Philip, in fact, was also a great, you could call him Philip the Great. Some people do call him Philip the Great, but it's not that many. But he basically built Macedon into a military power. They came in, they took over Greece, and then Philip had wanted to war against the Persians. He dies, he's poisoned. Alexander takes over. Alexander ravages, he roars through Turkey. He spends a decade, maybe even 11 or 12 years, basically conquering all of what Sargon had conquered. He conquers Egypt, he conquers the Levant, he conquers the rest of the Persian Empire. He moves northward into Armenia, northward into some of the Central Asian states like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan. He conquers Afghanistan. He conquers modern-day Pakistan. He's on the threshold of all of India, but then his troops revolt, and they say no, we want to go home. We've been at war for 10 years. We're sick of it. So they force Alexander to withdraw. They didn't like that Alexander took on some Persian wives and took on some Persian customs. They pulled back. Alexander then dies on the way home, and his empire is now probably 50% or more larger than Cyrus's empire. And when he dies, this is what's called the Wars of the Deodoci, which are the generals and the leaders that the guy who was left in charge in Macedon and some of these other generals, including Ptolemy that we see here. The Ptolemaic dynasty, for example, in Egypt is founded by General Ptolemy of the Macedonians. So when you hear of Ptolemaic pharaohs, they are actually the Macedonian descendants of Ptolemy. And so basically, again, you get the progression of the first empire, the first big, huge empire, and then Alexander is the first guy who, if he hadn't died, and if he held that empire together with the force of his will. And this is where a lot of the famous stories come in. His cutting of the Gordian knot. This is a famous myth about Alexander, that the knot that couldn't be untied. Alexander apparently came with his sword and just cut it and said, "I have solved it." And this is at the Delphic. This is, I think, near the Delphic Oracle. So that's why I set his play at Delphi, because I wanted him. He famously saw another Pythia, an old woman at the time, a Pythia, who said that he would, no force on earth could stop Alexander. So Alexander thought he was destined. He thought this was the final proof that he was the son of God, the son of Zeus. And these are all things that echo through his play. So anyway, that's the historical background.